particularly of the face and eye, of the head, face. Good day again. This is the continuation of your lecture series on physical diagnosis, part of your clinical diagnosis. So physical examination of the head, face, and eyes. I am Dr. Alferos from the Department of Medicine. Now, the general objectives of the lecture will be to identify the signs and symptoms in health and in disease, particularly of the head, face, and eyes, and to analyze and correlate the history with its symptoms with the physical examination findings or the signs in an attempt to arrive at a diagnosis, particularly of the head, the face, and the eyes. Now, we will start first with the head and the face. Now, the common symptoms in the head would be headache, dizziness, and vertigo. However, the headache will be discussed during your neurologic examination, which is part of physical diagnosis B or CDB, and the dizziness and vertigo will be discussed later when we discuss the examination of the ears. So we will proceed now with the common signs in the head. So you can examine the head and look at the size, the shape of the head, and look for the abnormalities. Now, one of the common sign would be on the hair texture. So you can see here that it is obvious that just on examination, and more so when you palpate, that the hair on the first picture would be fine hair. This fine hair is usually seen in hyperthyroidism. Now, in the second picture, you see a coarse hair, which is usually seen in hypothyroidism. Now, examination of the hair and scalp, sometimes you can see a scalp redness as seen in this picture. And there is also scaling as seen in seborrheic dermatitis. This redness and scaling is also seen in psoriasis, but usually there are plaques that are present. Now, examination of the scalp can also reveal some soft lumps like this. This is a pilar cyst or wens, and sometimes this can have some lumps that are pigmented, and you call this pigmented nevi. Enlargement of the skull can present with in hydrocephalus, so you will see the cranial portion to be enlarged. But in this picture, this is an example of an enlargement of the skull, mainly in the maxillary area as well as the mandibular area, as seen in Paget's disease. Now, palpable tenderness. Here you can see redness on the forehead. And if you palpate this one, this is probably secondary to a head trauma. And sometimes you can see bony step-offs that is also seen in head trauma. Now, next one would be facial swelling. When you look at these three pictures, the face are all swollen, but they come from different entities. For the first picture, you can see round or moon face because aside from fullness of the cheeks here, you see that the temporal area is also bulging. You see the red, and there is also excessive hair growth, and this is usually seen in patients who have Cushing's syndrome. Now, the next picture shows that the edema is more concentrated around the eyes, usually present already in the morning. These patients have edema and often are have pallor. This is the problems, particularly nephrotic syndrome. So the last one is a puffiness of the face that is perceived to be a dull fascie. Usually you can have puffiness around the eyes, more pronounced in the eyes, but this does not fit. Again, this can be seen in patients who have severe hypothyroidism or those who have mixed edema. Other common signs in the face. The first one, you will see that the head is elongated with bony prominence of the forehead, as well as the nose, the lower jaw. And when you look at the facial features, they are coarsened. This is seen in acromegaly or in growth hormone excess. Now, the next picture shows a mask-like fascie. It's like expressionless, no? And this one is seen in those who have Parkinson's disease. The picture here is of one of the boxers who's affected with Parkinson's disease, Muhammad Ali. Now, the next one, this female has excessive facial hair. We call this hirsutism. So when you look at the upper lip as well as the chin area, the jaw area, you will see hirsutism, okay? And this is seen in polycystic ovarian syndrome, wherein there is an excessive testosterone compared to estrogen, okay? And this one is also seen in other entities that will cause an increased testosterone in females. Now, we go now to the second part of this lecture, which is examination of the eyes. Now, the common symptoms of the eyes can be first, changes in vision. What are the possible changes in vision? First would be farsightedness or hyperopia, wherein you have problems in your vision, such as reading newspapers or books. Now, aging vision has been synonymous to farsightedness because as we age, we have problems with the near vision, and we call the aging vision as presbyopia. A lot of times, this presbyopia is evident by the age of 40 and older, and this is the time when reading glasses are being used by the patients, no? Now, nearsightedness is also called myopia, wherein you have problems in far vision. So you have problems looking at a distance, particularly in driving. Okay, now, other changes in vision, you have to ask if the visual loss is unilateral or bilateral. And aside from that, you have to ask, is there pain or it is painless? So for unilateral visual loss, that is painless, it's usually due to a vitreous hemorrhage that happens in diabetes mellitus or in trauma, those who have macular degeneration, retinal detachment, or a retinal vein or central retinal artery occlusion. Now for painful unilateral visual loss, usually it is due to a corneal ulcer, uveitis, a traumatic hyphema, acute glaucoma, and optic neuritis, which is usually a presentation of multiple sclerosis. Now, bilateral visual loss can also be either painless or painful. Bilateral visual loss that is painless is usually seen in giant cell arteritis, and painful bilateral visual loss is usually due to exposure to chemicals or radiation. Now, if the loss of vision is gradual, usually it's in cataract and macular degeneration. However, the slow or gradual loss can occur in those who have a central, no, visual loss, as in nuclear cataract. The cataract starts at the center. But sometimes you see this also in those who have macular degeneration. Now, visual loss can also be peripheral. So it starts at the sides. Now, this occurs in advanced open angle glaucoma. Now, the loss can be one-sided, and this is seen in hemianopsia and quadratic defects. We will discuss this further when we go into the visual field testing. Now, if you see moving specks or strands, most of the time it is due to a vitreous floater. However, if the defect is fixed, I call it scotoma, the lesion is usually in the retina or at the visual pathway. Now, the last one is you need to act urgently. If you the history says that the visual loss, there's a flashing light with a new vitreous floater or specks, then it can be retinal detachment of the vitreous from the retina. And this is very important because you have to identify, because this is fast and you can lose the vision right away. Now, other symptoms would be red eyes. So here in the first picture, you see a very red eye here at the upper portion. And this is a lot of times painless. You call this subconjunctival hemorrhage that can occur in hypertension, trauma, or it can just occur spontaneously. Now, this picture shows a just pinkish to red, so very subtle redness. A lot of times this is painless, but you can have a mild discomfort. And importantly, the vision is not affected. This is conjunctivitis. So the example of this one is a viral conjunctivitis. Okay. And then the next one, when you look at this one, it's red. It's like a very obvious that it looks like that the eye is about to pop out. Now, this kind of problem is usually painful with a problem in vision, so the vision is decreased. And this occurs in acute angle closure glaucoma, but can also be seen in corneal injury or infection. And if photophobia is present, it is due to acute iritis. Now, diplopia or doubling of vision can be horizontal. So if you look at the eye here, the eye is already going laterally. Okay, so this is a cranial nerve 3 defect because the eye is being pulled laterally, so the lateral rectus predominates, which is innervated by your cranial nerve 6. Okay, so abducens. You can also have a vertical problem in diplopia, and this one, you see that the eye is deviated upward. Okay, so sometimes you can have a diplopia only when you close the unaffected eye. So if the unaffected eye is closed, and there is diplopia, the problem is probably due to a corneal or a lens problem. Okay. Now, when you examine the eyes, you start from visual acuity, then the visual field, and then you go from outward to inward up to the, so from the eyebrows, eyeball, and then going to the conjunctiva, sclera, pupils, cornea, and lens, extraocular muscles, and you do fundoscopy. Now, you start with visual acuity testing using either a Snellen chart or a near vision or pocket vision screener. Here, this is the Jaeger chart. Now, normally you will have a 20/20 vision in which a normal patient the patient will see or read this line here at the 20/20, so that's the lowermost portion, the distance to which a normal patient with normal vision will see. So that's why it's 20/20. As the denominator goes up, then the vision is worse. So, for example, the patient is able to read here at the, okay, fourth from the bottom, so that's 20/40 vision. And the patient needs to wear corrective lenses. Then you will note that as 20/40 corrected, wherein the patient with corrective glasses can read at 20 feet that a normal vision patient can read at 40 feet. Now, as you go up here, the vision worsens. So, third row from the top would be 2200. So, as you go up, the denominator goes up and the vision is more constricted. So, this is 2200 is already legally blind. In most of the countries, legally blind means that you cannot drive anymore. Now, if you cannot see the number at the topmost portion, then you can do other testing like counting fingers, hand movement, and the last part would be, the last testing you can do is light perception. If there's no light perception, then that's total blindness, okay? All right, we now go to visual field. Now, when you check the visual field by confrontation, you can document the defect. So the patient might not be able to see the lower portion as depicted here. So this is a horizontal defect wherein the lesion is at the right side of the eye. The one that is affected is the central retinal artery, which is occluded, or there is ischemia of the optic nerve. Now, if the patient has monocular blindness, so unilateral monocular blindness as depicted on the lower portion, this is due to a lesion of the optic nerve. So if you look at these two, the affected eye, okay, the lesion is on the same side. So this is ipsilateral to the side of the lesion. Okay, now, if you have problem on both the temple area, so left temporal and right temporal, we call this bitemporal hemianopsia. And the most common lesion, the most common site of the lesion would be the optic chiasm. And the optic chiasm, usually it is due to a cellular or pituitary problem that impinges on the optic chiasm. That's why you have this bitemporal hemianopsia. Now, after the optic chiasm, you will have now a contralateral defect. Okay, so this one, you don't see the left temporal and the right basal. So we call this the left homonymous hemianopsia, in which the lesion is located at the right optic tract or at the right optic radiation. So here, after the chiasm, the lesion is contralateral to the affected side. Now, as I've mentioned earlier, you can have quadrantic defect. So you don't see the superior temporal quadrant on the left and the nasal upper quadrant on the right. And usually the defect is a partial lesion in the optic radiation, which is contralateral to the side. Okay? Now, after the visual acuity and field, we now proceed to examination of the eyes from outward to inward. So you look at the globe and you can see here abnormal protrusion. You call this exophthalmos, as seen in Graves' disease. A lot of times, Graves' disease will show you bilateral exophthalmos, but one can be worse than the other. Now, optic tumors can give you abnormal protrusion. A lot of times it is unilateral, but there are some that are bilateral. On examination of the eyebrows here, you will see that there is scaling or scaliness, and you see this one in seborrheic dermatitis. Now, eyebrows on the last picture, you will see that there is lateral sparseness or lateral thinning of the eyebrow that is seen in hypothyroidism. Now we go to the lids and the palpebral fissure. So you see an upslanting of the palpebral fissure here. Okay, so the palpebral fissure goes upward, and you see this one in Down syndrome. Now, for the eyelids, you see redness with swelling and some crusting that is present, and you can see actually there's also some conjunctivitis. And this eyelid problem is called blepharitis, so inflammation of the eyelids. Now, looking at the last picture, you see that there is drooping of the right upper lid, and you call this ptosis. And ptosis can be a manifestation of myasthenia gravis or a cranial nerve 3 oculomotor damage, or Horner syndrome, which I will discuss later on the other problems of Horner syndrome. And ptosis can also be senile or congenital ptosis. Now, other problems in the eyelids, here you can have lid margin that is going inward, and this is entropion, can be trauma or secondary to aging, scarring. Now, the next picture shows a lid margin that is directed outward. So you see this in elderly, this is called ectropion. Now, the last picture, you will see that when the patient looks down, you will see that the sclera is white and the upper lid does not cover part of the color portion, okay, of the iris. Okay, so what you see here is a positive lid lag test, and sometimes there can be retraction, and you see this one in Graves' disease. Now, other problems in the eyelids, you can encounter some nodules. So an example here is a painful, tender, and red infection at the inner, which is an obstructed meibomian gland, or at the outer, which is an eyelash follicle or tear gland. And this is called a stye or hordeolum. Okay, in Tagalog, it is called kuliti. Now, in contrast to this nodule that is non-tender and painless, this is usually a subacute blocked meibomian gland and points inside the lid. So this is what we call as chalazion. Now, this slightly raised yellowish, well-circumscribed cholesterol-filled plaques at the nasal portion of the eyelid is what we call xanthelasma. And this is usually seen in those who have hyperlipidemia and primary biliary cirrhosis. Now, moving on to the conjunctiva and the sclera, you will see here the normal sclera is white, but when it turns yellow, as in jaundice, this is due to a mainly a hepatic problem, hepatitis, or an obstruction in the biliary tract, okay, by a stone. So you can have what we call obstructive jaundice. Now here you will see local redness of a nodule. You call this nodular episcleritis, and this can be seen in autoimmune problems like rheumatoid arthritis and Sjogren's syndrome. However, you can see this also in herpes zoster, which is an infection. Now, This one is also a nodule. It is yellowish, triangular, and usually at the bulbar conjunctiva from the nasal, then the temporal side, and this occurs usually in aging. You call this pingecula. In contrast to this also triangular thickening of the bulbar conjunctiva across the cornea, usually it's coming from the nasal side and reddening may occur. If it moves and involves the area towards the cornea, then you can have visual problems. Now, for the cornea and the lens, okay, you can see this white circular line around the cornea, and you call this corneal arcus. This is normally seen in aging. However, in younger individuals, especially African American, and those who have hyperlipoproteinemia can have this whitish corneal arcus. In contrast, you can also have this one is a yellow to greenish discoloration around the cornea, as seen in Kayser-Fletcher ring, which is Wilson's disease, which is due to accumulation of copper. Now, the cornea can have scarring. As what you can see here, there is a grayish white opacity, and usually this is secondary to an old injury or inflammation. This is in contrast to an opacity of the lens, which is more posterior, and this is cataract, in which this cataract occurs in older individuals, or it might be due to smoking, diabetes, and those who have corticosteroid use. Now, we now proceed to the pupils. The pupils can be dilated or big, or it can be constricted or small pupils. So we have here two dilated pupils. One is tonic or Addis pupil, wherein the pupil is large, regular, and unilateral. Usually there is reduced load or absent reaction to light, and there is also slow accommodation. The cause of the tonic or Addis pupil is not known, although it can occur in trauma, surgery, and in instances of ischemia. Now, cranial nerve 3 paralysis will give you a dilated pupil, which is fixed to light and near effort, so there's no response. And there is concomitant ptosis or drooping of the eyelid, and there is lateral deviation of the eye because there is weakness or paralysis of your extraocular muscles. So the one that is predominant would be the lateral rectus, innervated by your abducens. Now, for a small or constricted pupil, you can have Horner syndrome, as what I've mentioned earlier, as a cause of ptosis. But usually the Horner syndrome is accompanied by unilateral small pupil, which is briskly reactive to light and near effort. So aside from ptosis, you can have loss of forehead sweating, and usually it is due to a brainstem lesion, a neck or chest tumor, an orbital trauma, or migraine. In contrast to Argyll-Robertson pupil. So Argyll-Robertson, two names, it's bilateral, so two pupils are affected. It is small and irregular, and there is accommodation, but there is no reaction to light. Now, this is usually seen in neurosyphilis, rarely in diabetes mellitus. Now we go to the extraocular muscles. You know that when you check the extraocular muscles, you ask the patient to look to the right and the left, up and down. Now, in the neutral position, just looking straight ahead, sometimes you can see already that there is a predominance of the weakness of one of the extraocular muscles. So here, you will see a middle deviation, so of the right eye. So there's a middle deviation, you call this esotropia. The next picture shows the left eye is deviated towards the lateral. Okay, you call this exotropia. Now, the abnormalities of the extraocular muscles can be due to paralysis of the nerves. So if you have a cranial nerve 6 paralysis, for example, here you have a left cranial nerve paralysis. So looking to the left, you will have a conjugate eye. So the problem will not be evident. But looking straight ahead, you will see already an esotropia or a medial deviation of the affected eye. Now, when the patient has to look to the left, then the esotropia is maximum, wherein there is actually no movement to look to the lateral side, okay, to the left side. Now, let's go to cranial nerve 4 paralysis, which innervates your superior trochlear. So, the problem with paralysis of the superior trochlear is that you will have difficulty looking downward and inward. So, if you look at the left eye here, so the deviation is maximum when you ask the patient to look downward and inward. Okay? Now, for cranial nerve 3 paralysis, aside from the paralysis of the extraocular muscles, so you can see here that the left eye is deviated to the lateral because there is no upward, downward, and inward movement of the eye, okay, because of the paralysis. Aside from that, you also have ptosis, and when you look at the pupils, it's dilated. Okay, we go to the fundoscopic examination, which is the last part of the examination. Now, when you look at the normal fundus, it will not be like this, no, in the first picture. This one is recreated by a camera. So when you look at and do fundoscopy, number 1, you should look for the red-orange reflex. If you don't see the red-orange reflex, most probably there's already a problem in the lens and you cannot fully assess the retina. And there can also be a problem in the retina, so there might be a detachment or there can be bleeding, so you don't see there can be vitreous bleeding, so you don't see the retina in full. So this picture, when you do your fundoscopic examination, is a recreation, okay, on looking at the several areas of the retina. So this picture is in your brain, no? So you recreate this one. Now, the normal retina will show you the optic disc that has a very clear margin, and you will see the blood vessels coming from, and you can see the physiologic cup there at the center. Now, if there is papil edema, which is swelling of the optic disc, you see that the margin is already blurred, and you see that the cup is already bulging. So this occurs in increased intracranial pressure in disease entities like meningitis, subarachnoid hemorrhage, trauma, and mass lesions. Okay, so that is papil edema. Now, in contrast to optic atrophy, wherein you will see that the optic disc is already white and you don't see the tiny disc vessels. And this occurs in optic neuritis, multiple sclerosis, and temporal arteritis. Now, findings that you will see in the fundus are hemorrhages. So this is an example of a hemorrhage. You can see a small and linear or sometimes a flame-shaped red streak. So parang may mga apoy-apoy siya dyan. Okay? And these hemorrhages or superficial retinal hemorrhages are usually seen in those who have severe hypertension, papil edema, or occlusion of the retinal vein. Now, this is another kind of hemorrhage, but when you look at this type of hemorrhage is larger. It obscures the underlying retinal vessel. And you see the demarcation line. There's a horizontal line in an erect patient. Okay, this is a pre-retinal hemorrhage due to a sudden increase in intracranial pressure. So I mentioned to you already what are the possible causes of intracranial pressure that can cause optic, the disc to be bulging. Okay. Now, other hemorrhages that can occur in the fundus, okay, so these are deep retinal hemorrhages. So what is the difference? These are usually small, rounded, and slightly irregular red spots. So it's dot and blot hemorrhages. Para kang nagwisik ng ink na red, no? So it's on different spots. And you see this one in diabetes, okay? Another type of rounded structures that you see here, this is not a hemorrhage, but a yellow round spot that occurs in normal aging or age-related macular degeneration. That's why you see that near the macula is a drusen. So this is not a hemorrhage, but round spots due to aging. Now, another type of hemorrhage would be due to microaneurysms. So these microaneurysms, the difference is that it's more in the area around and in the macula, and it's closer to the vessel. So what happens is that the blood vessels will have outpouchings, and these outpouchings can burst and produce hemorrhages also. So these are microaneurysms, no? Also seen in diabetic retinopathy. Now, this is a hemorrhage due to a neovascularization. So neovascularization or new blood vessel formation are usually numerous, tortuous, and narrower. They burst easily. And the reason for this one is in diabetes, there can be hypoxia in the retina, and this triggers vascular new growth. And this vascular new growth, okay, or neovascularization is called a more advanced type of retinopathy in diabetes. This signifies a proliferative diabetic retinopathy. Okay, now some of the vessels can get leaky and will form exudates. And this is an example of exudate wherein you see the exudates to be soft. It's like cotton. So parang siyang mga bulak, no? Patches in your retina. They can be white or grayish, ovoid with irregular or what we call soft borders. And this occurs in hypertension, diabetes, and sometimes HIV. Now, as compared to this type of exudates, so they are brighter, so they are creamy or yellowish, and they are well defined. So when you look at the margin, it's more of a hard border. So you call these hard exudates, and this is also seen in diabetes, vascular dysplasias. Now, in summary, we discussed the common symptoms of the head, face, and eye disease. And we also presented to you the signs of common disorders of the head, face, and the eyes. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions, I will be glad to answer them before we proceed to the next lecture on the examination of the ears and the nose. Okay, do you have any questions? I don't see anything here sa chat box. If none, I will proceed with the next lecture if you don't have any questions. Okay, so I'll proceed to the next question, the next lecture, okay? Good day. This is again the fourth part of the 5-hour lecture on physical diagnosis A, physical examination of the ears and nose. Again, I am Dr. Alferos. So again, the general objectives will be to identify the signs and symptoms in health and in disease, and to analyze and correlate the history or the signs or the symptoms with physical examination findings in an attempt to arrive at a diagnosis. Now, we will now proceed to the examination of the ears. The common symptoms in the ear would be first, hearing loss. In evaluating hearing loss, what are the things that we need to know in the history taking? First, you have to know the characteristics of the hearing loss. What is the duration of the deafness? Is it unilateral or bilateral? Is the onset sudden or insidious? Is the progression rapid or slow? What are the accompanying symptoms? Is there tinnitus, vertigo, or a spinning sensation of either the patient or the environment? Is there imbalance? Is there oral fullness, or is there a facial nerve dysfunction, or is there head and neck paresthesia? Also in the history, ask for a head trauma, exposure to ototoxins, Good day. This is again the fourth part of the 5-hour lecture on physical diagnosis A, clinical diagnosis A, physical examination of the ears and nose. Again, I am Dr. Alferos. So again, the general objectives will be to identify the signs and symptoms in health and in disease, and to analyze and correlate the history or the signs or the symptoms with physical examination findings in an attempt to arrive at a diagnosis. Now, we will now proceed to the examination of the ears. The common symptoms in the ear would be first, hearing loss. In evaluating hearing loss, what are the things that we need to know in the history taking? First, you have to know the characteristics of the hearing loss. What is the duration of the deafness? Is it unilateral or bilateral? Is the onset sudden or insidious? Is the progression rapid or slow? What are the accompanying symptoms? Is there tinnitus, vertigo, or a spinning sensation of either the patient or the environment? Is there imbalance? Is there oral fullness or otorrhea or discharge from the ears? Is there headache? Is there a facial nerve dysfunction? Or is there head and neck paresthesia? Also in the history, ask for a head trauma, exposure to ototoxins, and occupational or recreational noise exposure. Also, hearing impairment in the family history is important. Now, Sudden onset of unilateral hearing loss with or without tinnitus can be seen in viral infection of the inner ear, a vestibular schwannoma, or stroke. However, a gradual progression of hearing deficit is common with otosclerosis, a hearing loss due to noise, or a vestibular schwannoma. Another disease entity, which is Meniere's, may be associated with episodic vertigo, tinnitus, and oral fullness. Now, once you get a good history of the hearing loss, you should do a complete physical examination, but examination should be thorough in the ears. That will include auricle, ear canal, and the tympanic membrane. Now, in examining the eardrum, the topography of the tympanic membrane is more important than just the presence of the light reflex. Now, you know that the 2/3 of the tympanic membrane at the lower portion, the pars densa, and the upper portion, which is 1/3 of the tympanic membrane, which is above the short process of the malleus, you should be able to examine for retraction because this can be present in chronic eustachian tube dysfunction or cholesteatoma. Now, sometimes we do insufflation of the ear canal to assess the tympanic membrane mobility and compliance. But if you are not sure how to do this one, you can refer. Now, examination of the ear with unilateral serous effusions or unexplained otalgia should include a referral for fiber optic examination of the nasopharynx as well as the larynx to exclude neoplasms. Now, examination of the cranial nerves should also be done with special attention to the facial and trigeminal nerves because some tumors, like those involving the cerebellopontine angle, might be present. Now, this is lifted from Harrison, how to go about the approach in patients with hearing loss. As you can see, as in other algorithms, you really need to have a thorough history before you go to physical examination. Now, if the otologic examination shows abnormality, it may be due to a cerumen impaction, tympanic membrane perforation, cholesteatoma, a serous otitis media, acute otitis media, an external auditory canal atresia or stenosis, a eustachian tube dysfunction, or tympanosclerosis. Now, if the examination is normal it is a normal ear examination, then you can do audiometry, okay, or the auditory acuity. This is to differentiate if there is hearing loss that is conductive, sensorineural, or a mixed hearing loss. Now, at the bedside, we can do some tests that can differentiate the conductive from sensorineural hearing loss. Now, what are these tests? Okay, so the first test would be a Weber test. Now, you put a tuning fork at the middle of the forehead or the head, and you try to test the hearing of the patient. Now, let's say you have a problem on your right ear, and so that will have hearing loss on the right. Now, for a unilateral conductive hearing loss, usually the tone will be perceived on the affected ear. So if there is deafness on the right, the Weber test will be positive on the right side. So the tone will be heard more on the right side, or it lateralizes on the side of the lesion. Now, if you have a sensory neural hearing loss, what can be heard is that in the Weber test, it will lateralize to the unaffected ear because it will be the unaffected ear that will hear the tone of the tuning fork. So now you can also do a Rinne test. So it will test for the bone versus the air conduction. So normally, you do the Rinne test by testing for bone conduction here. And then if the patient cannot hear the sound anymore, you will place it on just at the side of the ear. So that will be air conduction. In normal persons, okay, without any hearing loss, the air conduction is louder or greater than the bone conduction. But for somebody, let's say the bad ear will be the right side. So what happens here if the affected ear is at the right side? If you do the Rinne test, what happens in a conductive hearing loss will be the bone conduction will be greater than the air conduction. So here. However, if it is a sensory neural hearing loss, it would be air conduction greater than bone conduction as what you hear in normal, because it is not the bad ear that is perceiving the tone produced by the wearer, but it is the normal ear that perceives the tone produced. So hearing loss, in summary, okay, can be sensory or sensory neural, in which in the history taking, you will know that there is trouble understanding the speech, there is worsening in a noisy environment, and usually occurs in the middle or later years. It is usually due to an inner ear disorders and loud exposure, an inner ear infection, trauma, acoustic neuroma, or congenital and familial disorders, as well as aging. Now, conductive hearing loss usually improves in a noisy environment and usually occurs in childhood and young adults. Usually, the problem is at the external or the middle ear disorder, and foreign body otitis media, a perforated eardrum, or otosclerosis of the ossicles are the usual causes. Both sensory neural and conductive hearing loss can occur in these drugs like aminoglycosides, aspirin, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, quinine, and furosemide. Now, another symptom that is a common problem in the ear would be dizziness. Now, when you have somebody who has dizziness, it is important in the history to really characterize the dizziness, as dizziness is not always a vestibular disorder. You have to know whether it is unilateral or bilateral, and or if it is acute or chronic. You have to focus whether it is a first attack or if it is several episodes already. You have to know the duration. Is it getting longer? What are the provoking factors? What are the accompanying symptoms? So usually, brief episodes of dizziness, usually occurring in seconds, are from a benign paroxysmal positional vertigo or BPPV or orthostatic hypotension. Both of these are provoked by changes in the head and body position. Now, intermediate in duration or minutes are usually those who are suffering from transient ischemic attacks of the posterior circulation, those having migraine, and there are other possible causes. Usually, a unilateral hearing loss or oral symptoms such as ear pain, pressure, and fullness typically point to a peripheral cause or a vestibular cause. However, if it is accompanied by double vision, numbness, and limb ataxia, it's usually a central lesion, and it points to a brainstem or cerebellar lesion. Unilateral hearing loss is unlikely in central lesion unless the lesion is near at the route of entry of the auditory nerve. So, if the dizziness is described as vertigo, it's a spinning sensation of either the environment or the patient, then it can be divided into a peripheral or a central problem. Now, peripheral problems are usually due to a benign positional vertigo, vestibular neuronitis, or acute labyrinthitis, Meniere's disease, a drug toxicity, or acoustic neuroma. Central, as what we have discussed earlier, is usually accompanied by ataxia or dysarthria, a cross-motor and or a sensory deficit. Usually, it is a central brainstem lesion due to atherosclerosis, but it can also be due to multiple sclerosis, a vertebro-basilar migraine, or a transient ischemic attack. Now, further examination of dizziness would include a thorough neurologic examination. Now, you also have to observe the range of eye movements as what has been discussed in the examination of the eyes. Usually, dizziness can be assessed through the eye movements. And if you see a disconjugate, meaning there is a difference in the eye movement of the two eyes, then it's probably a cranial neuropathy or an eye muscle weakness. Now, you also have to look for the pursuit, which is the ability to follow a smooth moving target, as what you do when you check for the extraocular muscles. And also look for saccades, which is the ability to look back and forth accurately between two targets. Here, if there is poor pursuit or inaccurate or dysmetric saccades, it is indicative of a central pathology, and it's often located at the cerebellum. Now, also examination for nystagmus is important. Vertical nystagmus, usually with a downward fast face or a downbeat nystagmus, and a horizontal nystagmus that changes the direction with gaze, or what we call a gaze-evoked nystagmus, points to a lesion in the cerebral pathway. However, a unilateral horizontal nystagmus is usually caused by a peripheral lesion. Again, in terms of vertigo, you can differentiate it into peripheral and central by looking at the nystagmus. Okay. For peripheral, it's usually an acute unidirectional with a fast face beating away from the ear with the lesion. Sometimes you can have a vertical or torsional nystagmus, so it's mixed, and you see that one in a benign positional paroxysmal vertigo. Characteristic of this peripheral nystagmus is usually it is inhibited by visual fixation. So you ask a patient to look straight on a fixed target, and the nystagmus usually goes away. And again, it's usually accompanied by a unilateral hearing loss. However, a central nystagmus usually changes direction with gaze. So if you try to move the head of the patient or the gaze, the nystagmus also changes. Now, it can be pure vertical or pure torsional nystagmus and is not suppressed by visual fixation. So even if you ask the patient to look at one certain point, usually the nystagmus persists. And it is usually accompanied by diplopia, doubling of vision. So dysarthria and limb ataxia. Now, you can also do a simple test, which is the head impulse sign. And usually, this is with acute prolonged vertigo. So, the head impulse sign is this one. So what you do is, what you're actually checking is the vestibulo-ocular reflex, or VOR. Normally, okay, the normal VOR is that you ask the patient to focus on your examiner's nose. That's a fixed target. And then you sharply turn the patient on one side. So here, it is on the right side. Normally, what happens is that the eyes gets fixated on the object that you're saying. So when you turn the head, the eyes will still fixate on the nose of the patient. So this is a normal VOR, or vestibulo-ocular reflex. This one is not present in a central lesion with nystagmus. So what happens in an abnormal vestibulo-ocular reflex? So if you ask the patient to look straight to the target, so to the examiner's nose, and you try to turn the head, you will see that the eye also changes in the direction. So, however, after a while, it realizes that it has to fixate on the target. So there is what we call a corrective saccade. Okay, so it goes back. Now, another way to test for dizziness will be the Dix-Hallpike maneuver. So this is usually a test for the BPPV. So what do? You ask the patient in sitting position to turn the head in 45 degrees. And then you slowly lower the patient in a supine position and have the head extended backward by about 20 degrees. And you have to look at the eyes. Usually, you will see a transient upbeating torsional nystagmus, which is present in a posterior canal BPPV. Now, if this is not present, you can repeat it on the other side. So if still it is not present, probably it's not due to the BPPV. Now, another test that you can do is a dynamic visual acuity test. So this is also to assess the vestibular function. So what do? You ask the patient to have the Jaeger chart view, okay, and check the visual acuity, then with the head still. Then after that, you try to rotate the head back and forth in about 1 to 2 hertz, no? Okay. And then after that, you ask the patient again to read the visual acuity. So if there is a drop of one line in the Snellen chart or the Jaeger chart, so near vision card, so this is abnormal and is indicative of a vestibular dysfunction. Okay. Another symptom would be earache. Now, earache, if there is an infection or inflammation of the ear canal, okay, you can have earache. So that is otitis externa. However, you can also have inner ear infection. So that's otitis media. Usually it's the pain is in the inner ear part. However, you can also have referred pain from the mouth, throat, and the neck. Okay. Now, what are the common abnormal signs that you can see in the ear? So externally, we mentioned about the symptom of earache. So what can you do if you have somebody who has an earache? So one of the signs that you will do is doing the tug test. Now, tug test is eliciting pain as you pull the ear upward, backward, and that will straighten the ear canal, and somehow, if this is painful, the canal might be swollen, narrowed, and moist, pale or reddened, and this is acute otitis externa. Now, if you don't elicit a painful tug test, and still the patient is complaining of ear pain, the tenderness can be elicited at the back of the ear. And if this tenderness is positive behind the ear, most probably you are dealing with an otitis media. Okay. Now, you can see thickening, redness, or itching of the canal skin in chronic otitis externa. A lot of times this one is not that painful as an acute otitis externa. Okay. The external canal, you can visualize here. Okay. You see non-tender nodular swelling covered by normal skin deep in the external canal. And this is what we call exostosis. Okay? Okay. How about examining the eardrum? The upper portion will show you the normal right eardrum. You know that this is right because the cone of light is anterior, so that's how that's pointing to the face of the patient. So this is the right eardrum. Now, findings in the eardrum can be, you can note for perforation of the eardrum. And it can be either central as what is seen in the lower picture. So this is central perforation. The central perforation usually does not extend to the margins of the eardrum. However, a marginal one will be extending at the margin. So nasa sides na siya. Now, this perforation of the eardrum is usually due to a purulent infection of the middle ear, but some perforations are traumatic. So yung natutusok yung eardrum. Okay. Other findings in the eardrum. So the first picture, you see a serous effusion. So you will see it's clear fluid and clear transparent fluid. And usually it is due to a viral upper respiratory infection or in sudden changes in atmospheric pressure, in which we call this otitic barotrauma. So either those who are skydiving or riding planes, no, na mabilis yung ascent, or those who are deep sea divers na that the change in the pressure in the ears are sudden, no, so they can have this kind of finding. Now, the next picture shows a very red, no, otitis, I mean a red eardrum, in which it is seen in acute otitis media. And you can see also, aside from the redness, a purulent or pus-like effusion. And this is usually due to a Streptococcus pneumonia or Haemophilus influenza infection. Okay. Other findings in the eardrum, okay, you can see a retracted eardrum. So yung upper portion is pulled inward. You can see here a healed perforation, the middle portion. And the last one would be tympanosclerosis, that whitish portion there, which is some form of scarring after either an infection, a trauma. Okay. Now, bullous meningitis somehow shows a very red tympanic membrane, and you can see a blister-like formation in the tympanic membrane. This usually occurs in Mycoplasma infection, viral, and some bacterial otitis media. Okay. How about testing for auditory acuity? So yung hearing. So you can do a bedside or a clinic test for hearing loss. Okay. So what you can do is do a whispered voice test wherein you whisper several numbers or letter, at least 6 to the patient, 1 ear at a time. Now, if the patient is not able to guess what you have whispered, so 4 out of 6 are wrong, no? Then this means that it is an abnormal whispered voice test and you need to do a further testing of audiometry. Now, presbycusis in older adults, okay, so it's like changes in the adult, like the one in the eyes, no? So it's aging hearing no? They usually have loss of the higher frequency sound. And a lot of times they miss the consonants rather than the vowels. Okay, so when you talk to them, they keep asking because sometimes the consonants are not heard well by the older adults. So again, in testing for hearing loss, auditory acuity, it can be conductive or sensory neural. So what happens? So for conductive hearing loss, there is little effect on the sound. The hearing usually improves in a noisy environment. Diba yung mga bata, no? They have their earphones and they talk and they still can listen to you, no? The voice remains soft because they can still understand what you're hearing, no? They can still hear. How about sensory neural? Usually the higher registers are lost and the sound may be distorted. So because of that one, the voice of the patient may be loud because they have difficulty hearing. And the worst thing is that usually hearing worsens in a noisy environment. Now, to differentiate the two, we already mentioned the two tests, which is Weber and Relay test. For the Weber test, usually this is good if you have only a unilateral hearing loss. So for a unilateral conductive hearing loss, what happens is that it lateralizes on the impaired ear. Okay, room noise is not well heard and detection of the vibration is improved. However, for sensory neural hearing loss, usually it lateralizes to the good ear. Okay, because the inner ear and the cochlear nerve damage will impair transmission on the affected ear. How about the Rinne test? In sensory neural, the air conduction better than bone conduction. It's because the unaffected or the good ear is the one that actually transmits the sound. However, in Rinne test, bone conduction is better than air conduction or just equal with bone and air conduction in the conductive hearing loss. All right. So we go now to the second part of the lecture, which is the examination of the nose and the paranasal sinuses. The common symptoms in the nose will be this. Firstly is rhinorrhea or rhinorrhea. This means any drainage from the nose. So it can be watery, but sometimes it can be purulent and it can also be whitish. Now, viral infections and allergic rhinitis or hay fever, and usually they will have watery nasal discharge, as well as vasomotor rhinitis and drug-induced rhinitis. The rhinorrhea or drainage of the nose can be accompanied by nasal congestion. So nasal congestion is a sense of stuffiness or obstruction in the nasal cavity, or sometimes also occur in deviated nasal septum or nasal polyp, a foreign body, or Wegener granuloma or carcinoma, and also drugs. So the common culprits are the oral contraceptive pills, reserpine, and alcohol, and also cocaine. Next symptom would be epistaxis. Epistaxis means bleeding from the nasal passages. The most common local causes are the following. Firstly, trauma. So those who keep on picking the nose are prone to have bleeding or epistaxis. It can also occur if there is inflammation, or if there is dry and crusting of the nasal mucosa, as in areas wherein there is very cold environment. You can also have epistaxis from tumors or presence of foreign bodies. Now, other factors that can cause epistaxis would be the use of anticoagulants, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and vascular malformations and coagulopathies. This one usually occurs sa dengue, no? Dengue. Okay. Now, what are the common signs? So, we start examination of the nose from outside going inward. Okay. Now, for the nasal tip or ala, so nasal tip here is an example. So you see a reddened nasal tip. And if you palpate this one, this is tender. And it is because of a local infection, for example, a furuncle. Now, for the nasal mucosa here, usually when you look at the nasal mucosa, you will see it to be pinkish. So that's the default of most of the mucosa. But if it is reddened and swollen, so usually there is viral rhinitis. However, if it is pale bluish or red, it can be allergic rhinitis. So if you look at the nasal mucosa here, it's a little bit on the pale side, and you can see there's a polyp that is somewhat bluish to red in color. Okay. How about the nasal septum? So that's at the midline. The nasal septum, aside from deviation, can have a perforation. And here you will see the perforation of the nasal septum, but this one uses a nasal speculum, so you can see it clearly, the perforation. It can be due to trauma, but it can also be due to a surgical problem, okay? And intranasal use of cocaine or amphetamines may give rise to a perforation, but a lot of times it starts out with a septal ulceration first. Now, nasal polyps are pale sac-like growths of inflamed tissue in the nasal mucosa. And if you see the picture here, you see the sac-like growth, and this is commonly seen in allergic rhinitis, especially those who have aspirin sensitivity, those who have asthma, those who have chronic sinus infections, and those who have cystic fibrosis. Now, other mass that you can see in the nose are due to malignant tumors. And malignant tumors are usually associated with the use of tobacco, okay, exposure, and chronically inhaled toxins. Now, what other signs can you note? We can do testing for sinus tenderness. So here in this picture, you see somebody eliciting tenderness of the maxillary sinus. So if you put your hand towards the frontal, so that would be above the eyelids here, then you are checking for the frontal sinus. So sinus tenderness, if present, usually is seen in acute bacterial rhinosinusitis. And the usual accompanying symptoms would be facial pain, pressure, or fullness. Now, purulent nasal discharge can also be present, as well as nasal obstruction and smell disorder. For these patients who have sinus tenderness, what you can do is to test for transillumination. So, this is the transillumination test that you can do to check for presence of sinusitis. Here is a positive transillumination test. So you see the light, no, shining. So the glow can be present. So the first picture shows a normal transillumination test in the frontal sinus. And on the next picture, you will see a normal transillumination test of the maxillary sinus. If this transillumination is absent, so you don't see that red glow on the frontal or at the maxillary, then that's absent transillumination or negative transillumination, wherein the most common problem will be due to an acute bacterial rhinosinusitis. Okay, so in summary, we have discussed the common symptoms of the ear and the nose, and we also went through the approach to hearing loss and dizziness, so the algorithm on hearing loss and dizziness, and also we looked at the signs of common disorders of the ears and nose. So that ends our fourth hour of lecture for the physical diagnosis A. If you have any questions, I can answer them before we proceed to the last part, which is the examination of the mouth and the throat. So if you have questions, I will. Okay. Do you have any questions? Let me see if parang wala naman dito. Okay. Any questions? Just okay. Wala. If there are no questions, I will dismiss you.